If you've ever felt intimidated by the thought of picking up a paintbrush, you're in the right place. This is the only video you need to watch to start your first painting, because we're not even going to paint, we are going to draw with paint and achieve something like this. This video is designed to guide you through every step of the early blocking process with ease and confidence. The main idea is that if you know how to have a good start, the rest will be easier to tackle, and in this video we'll focus on having a good start, drawing with paint. And you'll see that there is already so much to learn here, even though it doesn't look like it. With an approach inspired by the Atelier method, we'll break down the basics, demystify the tools and techniques, and simplify the process to provide you with the encouragement you need to start your very first painting. Let's first list the materials you'll need for this study, and you'll see that it's pretty simple. First, you need a canvas or gessoed paper, or like I'm using here for this study, oil painting paper. It's a specially prepared paper, perfect for small studies. That's what you want when you start oil painting. Next, you want an easel, sturdy and adjustable, so that you can put your subject and your model at eye level. 3, you need a palette for mixing paints. As far as paint go, it's pretty simple. We need titanium white, raw umber and ivory black, and simply odorless mineral spirits. Or if you prefer, you can use water mixable oil paints and water or a water mixable solvent. 5, we need brushes of various sizes and shapes. Some hog bristle filberts and synthetic rounds should do the trick. And finally, a model. We're going to work from a cast copy of Michelangelo's David's left ear. I'll put a link to a downloadable image of this cast that I'm using here in the description if you want to follow along, which I strongly recommend. In the description box, you'll also find links to my painting course if you want to explore the technique further. Based on the positive reviews, I also strongly recommend it. Alright, now let's see how to set up your workspace. Place your easel next to the model so that both the canvas and the model are on the same visual plane from your viewing spot. Or like I did here, you can place your model and your paper or your canvas on the same drawing board. If you're lucky enough to have a small cast like mine, you can try this setup. If it's bigger, you might need to use a black box like this one. But since these casts are pretty rare, you're most likely going to be using a printed model that makes it more practical to tape it right next to your paper. Finally, you want to mark a specific spot on the floor so that you can consistently view your model and your subject next to each other. Like I said earlier, this study is inspired by the Atelier method, but obviously adapted to a self-taught context. An Atelier student could spend like 40 to 50 hours on something like that, and maybe more, like it depends. Like really, if it's the beginning, you would spend even more time. So the entire thing is accuracy, trying to really copy it just as precisely as you can see it. The thing is, you learn that you don't necessarily know how to see it in the first place. Like, you realize that seeing is really tough, that you never really experienced seeing before you try to draw or paint what you see. The blocking process. Using a light wash of raw umber paint thinned with medium, give the canvas a light brown tone called imprimatura. You don't want black for the background for this exercise. Here the point is to practice drawing with paint, so we don't try to just paint the background black directly. We just want to keep this light brown raw umber wash as the background. If you start with full black paint, it's going to be kind of tough to trace all your lines. So the traditional way is to take a little bit of mineral spirits. I'm going to start with a wash of my raw umber first. And it's just going to help me trace the outline and start with a block in. I don't know why, it's always been like that in Atelier, and it actually looks cool. It's kind of gives this kind of brown undertone, which is very helpful for portrait, and I assume it's because it's more helpful for other things that we use this kind of underpainting wash like that.
Yeah.
Because for this exercise, typically it's not super helpful to have this instead of, just a flat neutral gray. But I don't know, I've always found it very pleasant. It's a nice warm tone. Kind of like it, find it soothing. Start with the top and bottom to set the proportions in place. The principle of our method is to start with a drawing of the same size as the model using the side size technique. To begin with, we'll locate the top and bottom first, then the leftmost and the rightmost points. The goal is to draw a basic frame to establish the first proportions, a bit like a big block of marble for a sculpture. Then continue simply building a super basic frame. Having established top and bottom, you can move on to left and right, and then you can start creating a very basic envelope. No curves at this point, keep things very straight and simplified. The whole process is about trial and error. Make a guess, check, and correct if necessary. The goal here is to reach accuracy. So you want to first try, check the accuracy, then do a second try, check again, and so on. I check the entire width and height one last time by holding my brush handle at arm's length and comparing with the distances and comparing the lengths on my model and on my subject. Then I lightly sketch the basic shapes and the placement of the various edges that I can spot on the model on my canvas. Use straight lines, that's super important, and you want simple shapes, and that's really block in. It's really like sculpting with big blocks first. Use mirrors and skewers or the handle of a brush to focus on the key proportions and measure to make sure that you have the right measurements and the right alignments. And you want to do that directly on your canvas. You want to compare the vertical and horizontal alignments frequently and try to, mentally trace lines and see where everything goes. Just a quick word on the method of this drawing study. And yes, I am calling it a drawing study, not a painting study, because it's exactly halfway there between drawing and painting. And here I'm still considering that it's more a drawing than it is a painting. But it's actually the perfect transition if you want to start a new creative journey and transition from drawing to painting. Creating a drawing study with paint and a brush on a canvas like that, rather than just making a simple drawing with a pencil or with charcoal, has several very unique benefits, and that's why I recommend this exercise. One of the primary advantages is the direct familiarity with the medium. Working with paint from the outset helps you understand its behavior, such as how it blends, the drying time, the texture, the fluidity, which are all crucial aspects when you want to move on to more complex paintings, but you don't want to tackle these aspects at the same time as you tackle the complexity of painting itself. Using a brush also forces you to think more broadly and dynamically, and you get to really become familiarized with your brush. A brush allows for a much wider range of marks, from broad strokes to fine lines, encouraging a looser, more expressive approach that can be difficult to achieve with a simple pencil. A brush is more like charcoal, but there's even more potential in a brush than what a charcoal stick can achieve. Using a brush will help you develop a fluidity and confidence in your gestures that will translate really well into the more lively and energetic compositional needs that a painting requires. And the fact that it's not truly a painting also makes it that it's an exercise that's way less demanding than making a fully finished painting. It will help you train your hand and discover the medium without worrying about the specific problems of, consistency, thickness, layering methods, color mixing, the fatal lean rule, all these problems that may arise in a fully finished project. But in this case, it's not a fully finished project, it's an in-between solution that takes the best out of both worlds and works great as a sort of a first introduction into the world of painting. You'll find it so easy to do that you'll truly feel confident enough to continue and push it to the next level, push it further, and actually start painting. That's your decision to make. And it's great if you have this level of confidence. That's exactly what this exercise is great for. But for the moment, let's focus on blocking the shapes with paint. The name of the game is simplifying. You want to block in the major shapes by simplifying them. Break down complex forms into simpler geometric shapes. This helps in maintaining proportion and understanding the underlying structure. Creating a block-in with paint involves laying down the foundational elements of your composition very broadly, focusing on establishing the major shapes, proportions, and the value shapes before you move on to the finer details. Begin by preparing your palette with a very limited selection of colors, raw umber and ivory black. Make a little mix of the two to get something rather neutral. And don't incorporate the white in the mix quite yet. At first, you want to use only raw umber and ivory black on your palette. You want to create something thin, so you just want to dip the tip of your brush in the odorless mineral spirits to get something very diluted. That's called a wash. A wash means that we're going to see the background color, so some of the white of the canvas is going to still be visible through transparency because it's going to be a very thin, very diluted layer, and we're going to use this white to create the highlights of the drawing. Using a large brush, you want to start sketching out the composition directly on the canvas with your chosen paint mixture. Focus on capturing the largest shapes first, simplifying the complex forms into basic geometric shapes like ovals, rectangles, triangles. This early stage is all about positioning and proportions, not details, so really work lightly and loosely. If you want to erase, simply fold a little piece of paper towel into some sort of a triangle and just use it to erase. You can use latex gloves if you're worried about touching some of this paint. You don't want to have the paint in contact with your hands. Right here, I'm really used to this technique, so I'm very clean in my approach and I never touch the solvent or I never touch the paint. But when you fold the little piece of paper towel to erase some of your lines, you want to really make sure that you're actually not touching the paint with your fingers. Once the major shapes are in place, refine the proportions and relationships between the elements of your composition. You want to use measuring techniques to try to compare the vertical, the horizontal, the angles, the main proportions. You want to make sure that the key parts of your subject are correctly positioned in relation to each other. Really comparing elements to each other, comparing neighboring shapes is crucial in understanding how to draw more realistically. You want to consistently step back from your canvas and really view your work from your distance, from your viewing spot. This is something from the sight size method that really helps, even if you're not following the sight size all the time. Really stepping back to your viewing spot and seeing your work from a distance, always the same spot to keep it consistent, really helps ensuring accuracy, perspective, and really helps with the proportions and the likeness. Next, you want to establish the major areas of light and shadows. You want to first identify where the light source hits your subject and where the darkest shadows fall. Using a medium value tone, blocking these shadow areas with broad confident strokes. This initial layer should be thin, allowing you to make adjustments as needed. The goal here is to just create a clear distinction between the light and the dark areas. We're not trying to, describe the values. We just want something that will guide our subsequent layers of paint if we continue and push this subject further. As you work, you want to continually refine the shapes, not in terms of details, but in terms of accuracy. You want to have them really look exactly as big or as small as they are on the model. You also really want to focus on the edges of the shapes, not just their size. You want to soften them or sharpen them as necessary to better capture the contours and volumes of the subject. This stage is iterative. You may need to add paint to redefine areas that have become too light, or use a rag or brush it off later. Go back over and over on the same areas and try to every time improve ever so slightly, so that each time you come back to an area, you make it better. I normally don't just go from top to bottom. I just look around, try to find some things to modify or correct, and every time I spot something, I immediately try to fix it. It's a game of looking up for mistakes to correct and correct them. Next, let's talk a little bit more about establishing the shadow shapes. You want to really identify very strongly the light and the dark areas. Determine the areas that are in the daylight and those that are in the night. You only have two sides, it's black or white, the dark side versus the light side. When you block in the major shadow areas, you want to outline their shapes, and at first you don't want to paint inside, you want to just follow the edge with precision. So this establishes the overall light and dark patterns, and it will help you in visualizing the form. So you continuously compare the painting to the model, you refine the shapes like that, and the shadow shapes will, at first, for the entire early stages of this study, will remain, empty, unfilled, and you make all the necessary adjustments to improve the accuracy. First, it's the accuracy. You don't want to focus on filling the shapes because there might be a lot of, proportion issues to fix. So what you really want to do is to make sure that the edges are in place, the shapes are correct. So this is all the early part, and then you want to mass in some of the values. And every time you want to step back to your viewing spot very frequently to check the composition, the accuracy, and it helps in seeing the painting as a whole and maintaining really sight size and proportions. And then you finally want to move on with midtones and highlights. That's what we're going to talk about next. So for the midtones and highlights, at first you want to just draw the outline of the shadow shapes and not fill in. But this is something that eventually you're going to do when you feel more confident in the proportions of your drawing. You want to gradually add those midtones and highlights. You want to blend smoothly to create a very basic sense of volume and depth. And for this, you want to simply dry brush the midtones in place. You don't need to be accurate with the values here. We're not worried about, is this just dark enough? Because we only have like two sides, lights versus darks. So we just want to separate them even more. We separate the lights from the darks, but it doesn't need to be very descriptive. And this is something that will only be possible once we actually mix the different shades together on the palette. But until the end of this exercise, we want to keep them separated and actually use all the pigments unmixed, one after each other. That's what distinguishes this study from an actual painting. We keep the white separated from the rest, and it's not fully mixed, simply brushed off. For the light tones, we are actually primarily using the white of the surface underneath, which makes it typically a drawing and not an actual painting. For this simplified value map, the paint is applied with an almost dry brush technique. We want something very light and very thin with no oil, no solvent, To the contrary, we want to drag the brush on a piece of paper towel to let it absorb some of the medium and make the paint even more stiff and dry. It has to be dry, almost like a drawing, really drawing with a brush. You want to focus on the overall composition in general rather than, getting caught up in details. The block-in is your painting skeleton, providing you with a structure upon which you'll build the rest. You want to maintain a balance between the various elements, ensuring that no part of the composition becomes too dominant or detailed too early. Finally, before moving on to the rest, you want to take a step back and assess the overall harmony and balance of your block-in. It should already start to look good. Even if it's just a very simplified version of the final painting, it should look harmonious and balanced and well done. Make any necessary adjustments to the proportions, the shapes, the values until it looks just right. This foundational layer sets the stage for the more detailed and refined work that will come afterwards if you actually push this painting to the next level. This is kind of like a very solid skeleton that you're trying to build, and that's a rule in general. You want to ensure that your painting, whatever it is and however you want to do it, has a well-structured base and a super solid skeleton. And finally, we can lay down some white for the highlights, but there again, this is a drawing study, so we're not fully mixing the white with the other pigments. We're simply overlapping it, brushing it over the wet canvas. Almost like a dry brush technique, but it will naturally blend with whatever's underneath. Again, we're not mixing all the shades on our palette and applying, a grayscale on the canvas. We're applying the paint separately. And actually, for the entire duration of this study, you want to always apply the paint separately, so this doesn't require you to mix any paint at any point. And you want to really take your time with each step. Accuracy is more important than speed. As I said, an Atelier student could easily spend 50 to 100 hours on the entire thing. So this exercise, which corresponds to the early phase of a cast painting, could take you 5 to 10 hours. It wouldn't be unrealistic. Really, the idea is to take your time because we're building something awesome here and we don't want to rush it. And you want to finish the study when the painting looks something like that. An outline still visible. Check. The light tones are mostly due to the light surface underneath that's still visible, a simple massing of the shadow shapes, and a few highlights, no details, no fancy texture, and no mixing of the white with the other pigments. So what's next? If you felt good about it, you can simply decide to push it forward and continue, like that. You simply mix the white with the other pigment to achieve a value scale that you can actually paint with. And now we're really diving into the magical world of painting, because the light surface of the canvas will not create the light areas of the work anymore. It's going to be covered with thick paint, and the light areas are now going to be made with white paint, and the painting will progressively go thicker and thicker, and that's where you really start diving into what painting actually is. So if you feel that this study was easy, you can easily move on to the next phase. But if you felt that reaching this point was very challenging, then do more of these and keep them for when you'll feel confident in your skills. There will always be time later to finish them if you want. Alright, that's it for this video, my friend. If you want another cool study to do, check this video. I'll see you for the next one, and as always, joy and inspiration to you.